Hello, world historians, and welcome to this review of the Schoellhorn snapshot review over the Middle East in AP World, where we're going to be looking at primarily the Islamic world from units 0 through 4. However, I do have to say, I say it's the Islamic world, but I do need you to understand that there are quite a few people living within this region that we're going to cover that are not Islamic. So that's just a very important point for you to understand. Okay, number one, I don't like to use the term Middle East to refer to this area because it's very Eurocentric. However, that's what most people recognize it as. But if you think about it, it basically tells the history of this part of the world from the context and the lens of Europeans because it's to the Middle East of them. China would never have called this part of the world the Middle East, but that's what it's known as. So we're going to go with that, even though it's technically very Eurocentric. All right, so let's start with period 0. And the reason I do this is because when period 1 picks up with this part of the world, the Islamic world is in its prime, like it's in its heyday. In fact, it's about to collapse under its own weight. So we have to look back at the fact that Islam, even though period 1 goes from 1200 to 1450, the Islamic belief system begins in the 600s, so the 7th century, long before period 1 even starts. So we have to start there to move forward. All right. First of all, please understand, Islam was not a new religion. It is a belief system that carries in, it continues, change in continuity, into period 1. And it's going to continue for lots and lots of different reasons. First of all, we have to talk about where this began. So we're talking about what is today Saudi Arabia. Back then, just the Arabian Peninsula. And please, let's clarify something, that not all people from this part of the world are Arabic. That is very, very narrowing. In fact, people who are Iranian, they don't consider themselves Arabic. They're Persian. They just happen to also be primarily Islamic, so people lump them all together. So just a very important part to understand there. So when Islam develops as a belief system, which for the record was not the first monotheistic belief system, Christianity and Judaism actually long before that, was around long before Islam. But what's going to happen is in Arabia during this time, Arabia is a very deserty area, and most of the people who lived there are nomadic tribes. And most of them were called Bedouins. Like that's what they would do, is they would travel around and trade goods that they would pick up in a market and then go trade them somewhere else. So the culture that Muhammad, who is the prophet of Islam, he is not the God, their God is Allah. Muhammad is the prophet. Muhammad was actually a Bedouin. He'd married into a very wealthy family. He was a trader. That's what he did. He was involved in commerce. And it's not going to be hard to understand that Islam had written into it, the beliefs of Islam, rules for trading. Like it basically, you know, because that was such a big part of the lifestyle, it even included in their religious text, it was, here is how you are a good person. Here's how you are a good business person. Here's how you are a good trader, which is why a lot of places will adopt Islam because they trade with Islamic Arabic people or people who are Islamic, because it came with a set of ready-made rules, basically all set for you to be in a trading community or a trading economy. So within Arabia, which is where Islam begins, you have Mecca and Medina, which are the two holy cities of Islam, along with Jerusalem, which is also important to them, located in Saudi Arabia. So just to give you some context of where all of this begins, all right? Let's review some major beliefs of Islam that just to understand what about the culture. Muhammad, again, not a god. He's their prophet. He's the last prophet, and he speaks for God. Like in the Quran, which is their holy book, that is the teachings of God as given through Muhammad. Couple of other things in this part of the world, men could have 4 wives under the Islamic faith. Let's talk about why within that context. This area was very tribal. There were a lot of conflicts. And in fact, when Islam comes around and unites these tribes together, there's going to be a lot of people who try to assassinate Muhammad, and it leads to a lot of warfare. This leads to a lot of deaths of males. So the ability to have 4 wives came from that you were taking care of these abandoned widows and orphans. And if you could not take care of them, you could not have them. Like that was a really big deal. The 5 pillars of Islam are their basic beliefs, kind of comparable essentially to the 10 Commandments, and if for a Christian lens or a Jewish lens. They are required to fast during the month of Ramadan. They are required to give charity. That's a very big part of their culture. They're required to make a Hajj or a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their life. They declare that Allah is the only God, that there's only one God, and they pray 5 times a day facing towards Mecca. They also do not allow eating of pork, and they do not drink alcohol. Another side thing I want to add to this is that within the Islamic world, women were actually treated a lot better during that time than they were in Europe, actually. Women in the Islamic world could read, and everybody had to be able to read the Quran. That's why they're so highly educated. Women could own property, they could divorce, they could be educators. They had pretty much some of the highest, rights in terms of women in the world compared to places like Song China during this time. Okay, now here's where this ties into where we're starting to get close to period 1. The major trade routes of period 1, the Silk Road, the Indian Ocean, and the Trans-Saharan trade route had been around long before period 1. They continue into period 1. And the Islamic world, especially in Arabia, is going to be it didn't even matter at this point. You could even say just the Arabic world was very involved in these. It just so happens they happen to be Muslim. But because they are Muslim, their belief system is going to travel outside of Arabia with them. And it's going to spread. It's a universal religion. Like anybody could be it, kind of like Christianity. So now one thing very important, they did not allow for forced conversion. They did not allow you to force people to be Muslim because that kind of defeated the point. So that was a really big part of their culture. So anyway, these people in Arabia are located right smack dab in the middle of these 3 major trade routes, and they're going to take advantage of that. And Islam just kind of made that easier because it had so many rules and regulations about good conduct and what you could do as a trader. So again, as these Arabic people get involved in these trade routes, when they become Muslim, their religion is going to spread with them, and it's going to become one of the widest spread religions in the world at this particular point. Notice it doesn't really spread to the Americas at this point during period 1 because they don't know America is there yet. So that is why. Okay, so here's another thing. Because of these Arabs getting involved, these Arabic people who happen to be Muslim, getting very involved in these trade routes are going to thrive. And as a result, the Arabic Empire is also going to thrive and be very wealthy because of their successful trading practices, their innovations. That's what they did. They were traders, and they were very, very good at it, and just went even more widespread once it becomes no longer located just in Arabia, and it becomes an Arabic empire that happens to be Islamic that spreads outside of Arabia. So just to show you right here, you can see, like looking at it, that the spread of Islam is going to spread along those trade routes across the Sahara Desert and even below the Sahara Desert, so that's sub-Saharan, in the Middle Eastern region, I hate calling it that, and in the Indian Ocean, particularly into Indonesia, which is this area down here, which has the highest concentration of Muslims in the world. Are they Arabic? No, they're Muslim. You can be Muslim without being Arabic. That's a very important part of this. In fact, there's a large chunk of Indian Muslims, and especially up in Pakistan and over in, you'll see this little dark section over here that is Bangladesh, which if you remember from period 4, that's whenever this was partitioned off after India got its independence, and the Muslim League asked for an independent state, which eventually becomes Pakistan and Bangladesh. Okay, so just to review, these are these major trade routes, and I wanted to show you this to just show, you can see the hash marks that are the Islamic part. You'll notice it doesn't really go much into southern part of India in this particular, in period 1, it doesn't really go into southern India a whole lot. All right, it's going to go into Indonesia. It will go into China, but China doesn't really widespread grab onto it because they have their own belief systems. Buddhism has made its way there, Confucianist, Taoist. China's very much in a we can do things on our own, we don't need your stuff kind of mentality, and they were kind of that way with Christianity as well. But look across North Africa. To this day, those countries are primarily Islamic because of trade across that area. Now, very, very important to understand that Islam is going to spread primarily in three different ways. The first way is through merchant activity. So that's through trade. Early on, when it spreads into Africa across the trans-Saharan trade route, these Arabs, as they traveled out with their Islamic belief system, developed technology that allowed them to get across the Sahara Desert and trade with the sub-Saharan areas like Ghana and Mali, because Ghana and Mali had gold and they also had slaves, whereas the Arabic world had things like textiles, but also salt. And salt was a very important commodity for keeping food fresh, for helping with illnesses, things like that. So we're going to see in West Africa and sub-Saharan, so below the Sahara Desert, a lot of people adopt Islam because of their trading, merchant activity with the Islamic world. Now, later, okay, once Muhammad dies, okay, because Muhammad was, you have to understand, a political leader. He's basically the Pope, the president, and a 4-star general all united together, because there were a lot of people in Arabia, a lot of tribes that did not like the message he was spreading. But there were also a lot of tribes united under Muhammad. So after Muhammad died, such an important major leader, he didn't really decide who was going to take that role after him. So his successors, the people who come after him, are called the caliphs. Now, at this point, it's just a title early on. And they called them, the first 4 were called the rightly guided caliphs, because they were truly just trying to follow in Muhammad's example. However, this already started issues in the Islamic community over who was supposed to be the caliph. Was it supposed to be a descendant of Muhammad, like a family line, or could it be anybody who's a good Muslim? And that's where you start to get that Sunni Shia divide already. Now, what happens is when Muhammad dies, these tribes start to break apart a little bit. So the caliphs gave them a united mission of, we are going to expand outside of Arabia. We are going to, as a tribal Arabic group, we are going to spread out and take over some places nearby. So they conquered Persia, they conquered the Byzantine Empire, parts of it, and they make it all the way across North Africa into Spain, because they had an incredible military united under this religious belief, and they were very, very good on horseback. Like, Arabians are some of the best horses, and they were incredible at what they did. So across North Africa, you're going to have mostly military conquest all the way into Spain. All right. So you have to understand, at this point, Spain in period 1 is controlled by it's part of the Islamic Arabic Empire. The other way that Islam is going to spread is through missionaries. The word missionary, you need to hear that word mission in it, because that's what they are. They're on a mission to spread their belief system. One of the big missionaries you're going to hear about are Sufi Muslims, and Sufi Muslims still exist today. And Sufis were very big on the fact that, okay, enough with the combination of politics, because so much of like politics and religion was like this. It was tied together and it was so political. And the Sufis were like, okay, take all that out of it. We don't really care about that. We just want you to have a relationship with Allah. We want you to have this mystical connection. And they focused on things like prayer and rituals and this mysterious power of Allah, and kind of turned away from the political aspect of it, which made it very, very popular in places that didn't necessarily have an Islamic government, but did like the idea of Islam. Now, one really important thing to understand about the Islamic culture is it is totally fine with education. In fact, they're very big on science as well, because in their mind, science and religion could coexist. Like, these two things didn't contradict each other like they did in Europe, where basically if you said anything against what the church said, you were in trouble. So that's a really big part of this. But they would do things like they knew medicine. They knew how to do autopsies and plastic surgeries, and they knew the origin of diseases. Like, they knew when a plague happened, not to go near it, and to also not go spread out, because that spreads it. They had an idea of how disease actually traveled. Whereas in Europe, they blamed the Black Plague on everything from not praying enough to, they blamed it on Jewish people. Like, they had no actual idea. So here's what's really important about this. There's going to be a lot of advancement that comes from the Islamic world. Algebra, they create that. They love to study Greco-Roman, so like Greek and Roman texts and things like that, like astronomy, the planets, geometry, like, and they basically turned the lights on in some parts of Europe while the rest of it was off while they were in the Dark Ages, because in Europe at this point, there's not a lot of learning going on. But these guys are studying and learning and advancing, and the art that they could create and the buildings they could construct because they understood geometry and building and architecture, and they spread all of this learning and translated these like Greek and Latin things from Europe. They translated them into Arabic so that everybody could understand it. But with that type of intelligence comes innovation. Like you come up with new ideas, some of which made trade for them a lot easier and a lot better. So for example, the camel saddle, like because camels can travel all the way across the desert on very little water, whereas horses could not. So that helped them to be in the trans-Saharan trade route. The lateen sail on the Indian Ocean, the rudder on a boat so that they could steer it. Monsoon winds, speaking of those sails that were meant to catch the wind, they knew the wind patterns that flowed like 6 months this way and 6 months this way. So that way they knew how to time out trade. And caravanserai, which are basically like camel hotels along like these trade routes to make it easier for people to do their trading. Now, they're also very intelligent when it comes to economics, right? Economics is how your state or whoever buys and sells and produces goods, right? That includes the labor that you have. Remember, this is important. The Islamic world did have slaves. They did get a lot of slaves from Africa. The difference is they didn't do a lot of slavery like we think of with like plantation slavery, where it's like super, super hard labor. Their slaves were more like domestic housework, women like for doing domestic labor. And the thing is, if they converted to Islam, they could no longer be a slave. And Islamic slavery was not passed down to generations. If you were born a slave, that doesn't mean, or actually you weren't born a slave. That doesn't even work for this particular culture. If you were a slave, you were working off a debt, or you were a prisoner or something like that. You could buy your freedom, and it didn't pass on to your children either. All right. They also developed financial instruments. So an instrument does something, it helps with something, and they could finance trade. Finance means you pay for it. So like flying cash, right? Which they could actually, like they adopted this, and it was like buying on credit, basically. You could, buy like on a credit card essentially, or bills of exchange, right? So like ways that you could get loans to pay for your goods. Now, one side effect that's going to come from all this trade, this is kind of a side thing, is that cities on these trade routes are going to rise or fall based on how well the trade was going. And in some places, these cities became very urbanized, like very, very crowded, because these were places of trading and exchange. So good news, if there was a lot of commerce going on, you wanted to live and be near where that activity was. Bad news, disease travels along trade. We've seen this with the Black Plague. So because of that, sometimes these cities could fall, or they could get invaded because they were extremely wealthy because of trade. So two examples of this are Kashgar and Samarkand. And I just want to show you guys where these are located, right along the Silk Road trade route, which became major trading cities because of where they were located, that people could stop here, sell their goods, buy their goods, without maybe having to travel all the way to China or all the way back to Europe. Now, one other major effect that's going to come from this in period 1 and in period 0 is all of this movement of people, especially traders, is going to lead to what's called diasporic communities. That word means to disperse, to spread out. Because what would happen is, as these people traveled, they would sometimes stay in the areas they traded. So for example, if you left Arabia, where Mecca and Medina are up there, and you took the monsoon winds down to East Africa, you're probably going to be there a while. Like you're going to have to wait 6 months to go back. And sometimes these guys would stay there. They would get married. They would start families. And this happened in Indonesia as well, or as slaves converted to Islam and went to different places. So you start to get a new community. And the Swahili city-states are right here on the east side. And Swahili is a combination of Bantu African and Arabic language. And you've got a large chunk of people on that side that actually are, Muslim because of that. this part on East Africa to understand, notice that Islam does not go into the heart of Africa. That's because they can't. They are not immune to the diseases in Africa yet. They do not have that ability. So that means that a lot of states in Africa are going to get very wealthy by being the middlemen for these guys. Like, they could get stuff from the interior, like slaves or gold or, you know, furs or whatever, and then sell them, trade with them on the outside. So you get states like the Great Zimbabwe in South Africa, which was very, very wealthy. In fact, it was so amazingly impressive how well it was built that the Europeans thought that the Greeks must have built it, because there's no way the Africans built it, which is just absolutely horrible and terrible. Okay, so we're also going to see some places that develop that do adopt Islam, but are also incredibly powerful because of trade. Like, they learn how to control trade in this area. And one example is the Sultanate of Malacca. So, excuse me real quick. All right. So right here in Indonesia, you can see that strait right there, which is a nice shortcut to get to some of these trading areas without having to go all the way around, kind of like the Suez Canal. And this Sultanate realized, the Sultan, number one, he adopted Islam. And a sultan is a leader, a political leader who is Islamic, but doesn't get to rule because he's Islamic. It just happens to be more of an Islamic country, okay? So this sultan and other sultans after him figured out that they could, like, basically pay, like, they could tax you to go through this area. Like, you want to do the shortcut? Pay us. And we're going to tax your trade on the way through, making them very, very wealthy. Yes, by some of the stuff they traded, but also just because they controlled the trade route. Okay, so let's go back to Europe, all right? Or actually not Europe, this is Afro-Eurasia right here. And you can see that so down here is Mecca and Medina. This is where Islam begins. Everything in green, okay, so this area down here, actually not everything in green. This is where Islam begins. This is where Muhammad unites the tribes together. He dies. And then the caliphs start expanding out of Arabia. Technically, this is an Arabic empire because it's Arabic people who happen to be Islamic who did it, and Islam is going to spread all the way out throughout this area as Islam expands, all the way up into Spain. And this place in Spain was Jews, Christians, Muslims lived there together just fine. So much learning happening, so much advancement. Everybody was living there just fine, until Europe decides that they want that back and go on a mission to get it, but that's in period 2. So this is where we start getting into period 1, okay? One small thing to add, another thing that's going to spread around the world because of all of this trade from the Islamic world is going to be foods. So, for example, from Indonesia, we get bananas, which make their way to Africa, huge staple food there. Citrus fruits begin in Indonesia, make its way into the Islamic world, make it all the way to Spain. And guess what? When Spain ends up later conquering the Americas, they conquer Florida and the Caribbean, taking those citrus fruits with them, which is why Florida is known for its oranges. It came from the Islamic world that eventually was taken over by the Europeans. And also sugar, which sugar is going to be another thing that's going to make its way across the Islamic world. Whenever Spain conquers the Americas, they figure out that sugar grows there, which is going to lead to, unfortunately, the beginning of the slave trade. All right, now, I told you all of this to tell you period 1, whatever we pick up in period 1, which this makes no sense, is at the height of the Islamic world. It is all of that you saw on that map was under the Abbasid Caliphate. All right, so one ruler under the Caliphate, their capital is going to be in Baghdad, which is a huge mistake. Baghdad is right here in Iraq. Huge mistake because you've got a lot of empire to the left that is not being kept an eye on. So that's a problem, and it will end up causing them problems. All right, but, all right, under the Abbasid Caliphate, the Islamic world is having its golden age. It is absolutely thriving. It is relatively peaceful because the Abbasids have it under control. They have a wonderful military, and they're very big on that continuation of learning. Again, algebra, they adopted geometry. They got the number 0. We call it the Arabic numerals, but the number 0 actually came from somewhere else. There's the House of Wisdom located in Baghdad, which that's exactly what it was for learning to take place and sharing of learning. Anybody, Christian, Jew, whoever, doesn't matter. You can go there and learn and share your knowledge because everybody benefits from everybody else. And remember, Muslims consider Christians and Jews people of the book because they are all three monotheistic faiths that are very, very similar and all connect back to their founder or patriarch Abraham. So they treated them very well. Usually you'd have to pay a tax. If the Muslims took you over, you could convert to Islam or you could pay a tax. Most people chose to go ahead and convert to Islam, right? But that tax could be a source of contention. Now, I know I just talked a whole lot about this, and you're like, Schoellhorn, you talked about period 1 with this for like 5 seconds. That's because most of what I talked about in period 0 continues into period 1. The big difference is that in period 1, that Abbasid Caliphate, that united caliphate of one Islamic empire is going to collapse, all right? And when that happens, all right, it's going to be due to some internal and external problems. Internally, the Abbasids rulers, the caliphs, were starting to act kind of like Persian kings because they're right next to Persia. They saw how nice the Persian shahs lived, and they were kind of like, we're going to act like that. The people are like, I think you're losing the entire message of what Islam is about. This became very much a political thing and a power thing, and we don't like it. So what starts to happen is that parts of the caliphate to the west, like Spain, North Africa, they start to break apart into smaller Islamic states. Notice I said Islamic because they stay Muslim, right? So like sultanates, emirates, those are all Islamic areas. Now, another thing that's going to cause an internal problem, because guys, when your empire is weak on the inside, it's not strong enough to fight a threat from the outside. Right? You're just not strong enough internally to do it. And there was a lot of fighting over whether the caliph should be Sunni Muslim or Shia Muslim. Most Muslims were Sunni, but there was that group of Shias who did not like the fact that this ruler was not a descendant of Muhammad and at this point, it's also about other beliefs in terms of that, but that was the really heart of it at the start. And so those internal problems start making these different states break away from the Abbasid Caliphate and form like their own sultanates and stuff like that. And then eventually the Mongols come storming through, and the Mongols absolutely massacre the Abbasids and the Persian area. Number 1, because the Mongols hold a grudge, and number 2, because the Abbasids had the audacity to fight back. It just did not end up well for them. All right, now, very important to understand, okay? Even though the caliphate is gone, even though there's not like, okay, kind of like in the United States, if we weren't the United States anymore, we would still be the individual states, most likely, all right? And we would still hold on to those things that make us that state, all right? I guarantee you, if we weren't the United States anymore, St. Louis would still eat toasted raviolis. It's just who we are. We would still have the best fans in baseball, and we would still be Blues fans for the most part. Now, that's going to happen after the Abbasid Caliphate collapses, and a new group is going to move in. Why? Because that's what we do. Humans compete, they move in, their goal is to get their hands on as much as possible because that's just in us. That's who we are. So, a new group moves into this area called the Turks. Now, the Turks are kind of like the Arabs. There's lots and lots and lots and lots and different groups of them. They're different tribes of them. And they're going to come in and they're going to scatter all over the place. However, they're going to go through what I call the Islamic perfume cloud. So imagine somebody sprayed the Islamic perfume and these guys came through it, and it stuck with them. So whenever they took over other places, this made it very easy for some of them because they were going into areas that were already Islamic. So it wasn't that big of a change. It also means that Islam is going to continue because a lot of these new states are going to be Muslim, and they're going to establish that as the official religion of their area. So a couple of examples of this are, number 1, the Delhi Sultanate. Notice that word sultan, that's a clue, that's Islamic, which was the first Islamic state created in India. Notice it's in northern India because you cross the mountains from Persia, and there you are. So this is the first time that an Islamic group, they're Turks, okay? They're the Turks, just like these other groups of Turks. They're Turks, they're Islamic Turks, and they established the Delhi Sultanate right here in India, okay? Then you get the Seljuk Turks. These guys are going to cause some real problems. When they come through and adopt Islam, they're going to go all the way into the Byzantine Empire, which was basically all that was left of what used to be Rome, and they're going to invade the Holy Land. Like, they're going to invade the Christian Jewish Holy Land of what we know today as Israel, and this is going to cause the Pope of Europe to call for the First Crusade, where he unites Christians together in Europe to go and get the Holy Land back. It's going to start a series of 12 crusades that the Christians only win one of them. They never actually get the Holy Land back, but they do damage the Turks quite a bit. And this tension, because of the crusades, is going to cause enough problems that when period 2, when Europe actually gets involved in the trading game, they're going to have to go all the way around Africa instead of going through the Middle East because of those old feelings about the issues with the crusades. Another state is going to be the Mamluk Sultanate. The cool thing about the Mamluks is they were formerly slaves who became trained as soldiers, and they were incredibly good soldiers. And eventually they break away from the Abbasid Caliphate as it's weakening, and they create their own sultanate right here in kind of like Egypt and northern Arabia. They are super important because these are the guys that actually, when the Abbasids were collapsing, stopped the Mongols from getting any further. The Mongols did not get the Holy Land, and they did not get into North Africa because of the Mamluks. And this is going to be a very powerful sultanate until they get overthrown by the Ottomans later on. Now, we've talked about some of these states, but we also have to mention that over in West Africa, there's going to be, in period 1, another really powerful state that grows up because of their exposure to trade and also their adoption of Islam. And that's going to be Mali. Mali was incredibly wealthy as an empire. And guys, remember, an empire just means you rule over people who are not you. All right, that's one state conquers another. Congratulations, you're an empire. And Mali at this particular time was doing amazing compared to Europe. They're so wealthy because of their connections in trade and their sale of slaves and their sale of gold. And it was so wealthy, in fact, that one of their Mansas, that's what they called the rulers, Mansa Musa, he's a Muslim, and he has to go to Mecca to make his Hajj, or his pilgrimage. And on his way across, he took so much money with him that he caused inflation in Egypt because he put so much money into their economy, giving money away. And he literally put Africa on the map and made Europe start to realize, wow, there's some really impressive stuff going on down there that we are not involved in. All right, so how do we know so much about all of the stuff going on in the Islamic world? Well, Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta is the Marco Polo of the Islamic world. This guy was an Islamic jurist, so he knew Islamic law very, very well. And these are the routes of his travels that he took all over the world, and he wrote about them in detail. And one of the things he was always really surprised about is how much people would adopt Islam, but not necessarily the Arabic tradition. So, for example, veiling your women, or, stuff like that. He's like, what are you guys doing? Your women are just walking around without their faces covered. And they're like, yeah, that's fine. We're Muslim, but we're not Arabic. And a lot of those traditions that people think are Muslim are not. They're from Arabic culture that became embedded into Islam, but not everybody accepts those. Even to this day, people in different Islamic cultures, the women show themselves different. In Bosnia, you might not even know a woman is Islamic, whereas in Saudi Arabia and Iran, where they're much more conservative, old school, and Muslims been around a long time, they're much more covered head to toe, and women have much less rights in those parts of the world. Okay, so period 2, here we go. After the Abbasid Caliphate collapses and those Turkish states kind of collapse, this is what we do. It's all about expansion. It's all about, hey, there's a power vacuum. We must go in and grab it. And we're going to get 3 new Islamic states that are going to rise up, Islamic empires. And we're going to call these the Gunpowder empires because they achieved such success through their use of gunpowder, which they got from China. So this is your three gunpowder empires, right? The Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. Now, important to understand in period two is all about expansion. Why? Because that's what every time period is about, except period 4. In the second half, when we finally go, okay, enough expanding, we can economically expand, but we can't physically expand anymore because now we have nukes and that'll cause World War III. So no. But these three gunpowder empires are all Islamic, all gunpowder empires, all extremely powerful in period 2, along with the land-based empires of Russia and Qing. Now, the difference during this time is going to be Europe is going to finally get into this game, except there's really no land left for them to get as far as they knew at that point. So they're going to have to do maritime empires, but that's a whole nother video. This is the Siege of Constantinople, which the AP exam likes to reference because this is when Europe woke up and went, oh my God, these guys have a lot of firepower, because Constantinople was supposed to be a city in the Byzantine Empire that nobody, which is today Turkey, which nobody could get. And these guys, the Ottomans, came in with these cannons and these siege tactics to surround a city and basically starve it out that nobody had seen before. And it was a huge wake-up call. Now, the problem with these three gunpowder empires is if they had been united, oh my gosh, the world would have been in trouble. But they're not, because they have an internal issue between them. And one of them is, the big one, is the Sunni-Shia conflict. The Safavid Empire, which today you guys know as Iran, was Persia, right, was decided that they're going to be Shia Muslim. And the reason for that is because that gave them a distinct identity for people to be loyal to. Whereas if they'd been Sunni, it would have been really, really easy for them to fall into like the Ottoman or the Mughal. So this made them basically an island of Shia surrounded by Sunni. And it's going to cause so many problems between the Ottomans and the Safavids. And basically one big battle between them decided the border of like where Iraq was. Like that's kind of the cutoff. And you can see even today, the legacy remains, because where Iran is, which is what the Safavid Empire was, is still primarily Shia. So that's still causing conflict today. Now, one thing that's going to come from this is as these empires expand, and this happens all the time, you're going to get belief systems that run into each other. So, for example, in India, you have Muslims coming in that are the Mughals, but you also have coming in, you're coming into a Hindu culture. And this causes a lot of fighting and a lot of contrast. So what you're going to get is what's called syncretic religions, where religions like sync up and join up different beliefs and kind of create a new religion. One example of that is going to be Sikhism, which develops in India, which actually is neither Hindu or Muslim. It was kind of done with the issues between them. Is monotheistic, believes in just one God. And they're very identifiable by the turbans that they wear, because Sikhs don't believe that you cut your hair your entire life. So the turban helps to kind of protect that. So just kind of a new religion that developed in India that is still around today in this Punjab region of India up here to the north, which actually they kind of think they should have their own state because they are such a separate group. Okay, this is important to understand, okay? When a new empire takes over an old one, or a new state takes over another one, you kind of think of it as a school getting a new principal, all right? Or a company getting a new CEO, but I'm going to use this as like, you know, an education example. When we get a new principal as teachers, it's always scary. Like, oh my gosh, are they going to come in and change everything? Are they going to bring in their own staff? Are they going to, like, we always wear jeans. Are we going to be allowed to wear jeans? Like, are they going to change everything? So these new principals have decisions to make. How much am I going to shake things up? Because if I don't change things a whole lot, then maybe people will be more comfortable and everything will be okay. So in some situations in these gunpowder empires, that's what they did. They didn't shake things up a whole lot. For example, the Mughals, when they first got into India, realized that they were the minority. Like most people there were Hindu. Just like a new principal would be like, wow, I'm the minority here. All right. So he decided under Akbar, they were going to be incredibly religiously tolerant. He built churches, he built temples, he took a Hindu wife. Like, he was very, very good to those people. The Ottomans, who are Muslim, whenever they took over that area, they realized they were ruling over, especially in the Byzantine area, a lot of Christians. And they were, to some degree, pretty tolerant of that. They actually had what's called a millet system, where if somebody broke a law, like a Jewish law or a Christian law, they would allow the judges who are Christian or Jewish to deal with it based on their religious beliefs instead of according to Islamic law. Yes, they were still second-class citizens, but at least they had that going for them. All right. You also have to, as a new boss, are you going to respect the people who already have the knowledge and who already are familiar with the building? Or are you going to come in and completely change it up? The Qing, when they went into China, completely changed it up. Like, they took all of the Han Chinese and kind of bumped them out and put in new elites that were Qing, like basically putting in your own people, right? Some of these guys were like, nope, we're going to allow the old people to kind of still have some say so that people will be more on board with this transition. So, like an example, in Mughal India, the zamindars were people from India that the Mughals were like, hey, you've been here a long time. You know the drill here. You're going to be a chief over this area, and you can collect taxes for us as an incentive, and you can keep a cut of it. Just make sure we get our taxes. And that made people a little bit more comfortable. The Ottomans, on the other hand, create kind of a new elite with their devshirme and their janissaries, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, very important to understand, and this goes for literally everywhere. I don't care if you're Aztec, Chinese, African, doesn't matter. You don't have an empire if you don't have a strong military. You just don't. All right. So what's going to happen in these states is they have to get a military that is a professional military that is loyal to the ruler. Not like feudalism in Europe where you're loyal to the lord whose land you live in, not the king. They wanted militaries that were professional, that could be ready to fight at any given time, that were loyal to the sultan or the emirate or whatever. So in the Ottoman Empire, they created the devshirme, which is kind of like a blood tribute where you would go, they would go to Christian boys, they would take them from their families to remove the loyalty to the family. They would convert them to Islam. They would train them to be soldiers, and then they could work their way up and really be something in this culture. They could be, janissaries, which is like this elite fighting force. Now, notice they always have them wear red, so that way they can't escape. So you always know where they are. So it's not like they trust them 100%. But you could really be educated and become like a vizier. You could become an advisor. You had so many opportunities to rise up to becoming an elite. So that was kind of a way the Ottomans created this loyal army to them because they're ruling over an area that's not them. They want people who are loyal to them, so you got to offer them a lot of incentives. Now, you can't have a military if you don't have taxes. That's why taxes are so important within these states. How are you going to pay for this? In the Aztec world, it was through tribute. You go get tribute from the people you conquered. You use that to reward your soldiers. In the Ottoman world, you do tax farming. So what that means is you give someone the ability, they basically buy the privilege of being allowed to collect taxes in a certain area. And then what they would do is all they had to do is make sure that they gave the Sultan the required amount, which means they could pretty much charge whatever they wanted and keep the rest for themselves. So this is going to cause some problems, and it is pretty corrupt. Okay. Another continuity that you're going to see across all the time periods, especially as we're talking about expansion, two things. Number one, religion equals rule, right? Because God said so is the ultimate reason to say why you get the right to rule forever. In fact, it's going to work in Europe even until the Enlightenment. But not everybody in the world gets the Enlightenment. The Chinese used the mandate of heaven. They said that the heavens had chosen them as the rulers. In England and Europe, it was divine right. God said so. He gave me this right to rule. And another way you do that, another way you show your power, this is another continuity, power is only power if you can see it. So these gunpowder empires, just like everywhere else, including the Inca in the Americas and everywhere else, they're going to build really big buildings that honor two things: their rulers and their religion. Case in point, the Mughal Taj Mahal. It has minarets, which show that it's a religious building, but this is also a tomb built by the Shah for his 14th, for his wife who died having his 14th child, I think. But it's enormous. It's white marble. It's massive. And it just kind of shows that he can. And power is only power if you can see it. Okay, now, obviously, just like throughout history, there's going to be rebellions against these new empires. That happens in every single time period because nobody wants to be ruled by somebody else, especially if those rulers are not good. And this is going to happen in India under the Mughals, because later, after Akbar's descendants, a new ruler called Aurangzeb comes around. And Aurangzeb is not very nice. He is going to be very mean to the Hindus who live in India and make them second-class citizens. And this is going to cause some rebellions. And one of those is the Maratha Rebellion. And the Marathas are going to unite as Hindus together against the Muslims and actually successfully develop their own little state. Because of it, you can see it right here in gold off to the left of the Mughals, that they actually established their own state in rebellion. Okay, period 3. Not a whole lot's going to be going on in this area, guys, and that's because these gunpowder empires are so busy fighting with each other and fighting with themselves, they're not really too worried about, industrializing or doing what Europe is doing. And again, these guys don't want to do what Europe is doing because they hate them, because of the legacy of things like the Crusades and the fact that they rudely butted themselves into a well-established trade network in period 2. All right? Okay, so now one of the problems that's going to come with this, and the fact that this part of the world doesn't really industrialize or advance, is it's going to make them easy targets for the Europeans who are going to make that decision. Okay, now, there are going to be some places in the Ottoman Empire, and within these empires, that are going to decide that they do want to industrialize, even if the Gunpowder Empire does not. And a really good example of that is going to be in Egypt under Muhammad Ali. Now, technically at this point, Egypt is still, you'll notice the guy wearing the turban, he is still part of the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottoman Empire was weakening so much that Egypt actually convinced the Ottoman Sultan to be like, listen, can I just do my own thing down here? Are we good? Can I just do this on my own? And what he decided is his particular state, his area of Egypt, was going to start creating cotton. That was going to be their really big thing so that they could export that cotton and export those textiles to Europe, who really needed cotton for their textile factories. So Muhammad Ali state leads, like this is not individual people, this is the government doing this, this is the government hiring people, is going to start producing a lot of cotton. You've heard this before, like Egyptian cotton. It's a really big deal, which the British loved because right at this time, America was involved in a civil war and they weren't providing the cotton that Britain usually purchased. So they started buying up all of this Egyptian cotton. And in fact, they started giving Egypt loans. Like, here, you do more factories, do more. And Egypt took the loans thinking it would be no problem to pay it back with all the business that they were getting. That's not going to happen because after America ends its civil war, Britain's going to dump Egypt and start buying American cotton again for dirt cheap. And Egypt can't pay back its loans to Britain, which means that those loans default. And now technically those factories are owned by the British. And in order to get out of the hole, basically Egypt has to give Britain the majority shares, which is like the majority ownership of the Suez Canal, which is a canal that literally runs through Egypt so that Britain can get from the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea to India, which is where one of their big colonies is, very, very quickly. This is going to hurt Egypt very, very bad. This ought to show you, this alone, like that Egypt was kind of doing its own thing, just how bad the Ottoman Empire was doing in period 3. They were actually called the sick man of Europe, particularly by the French, because they knew that the Ottomans were they weren't industrialized. They needed help fighting against the Russians in the Crimean War because Russia really needed to get a warm water port during their expansion. And the only reason the Ottomans won is because Britain and France jumped in. And lots of people were breaking away from them, like the Balkan Peninsula, which is where Serbia and Bosnia are. Remember World War I? They broke away because they were very nationalistic and didn't want to be Ottoman. So you get a sultan named Sultan Gulhani in 1839, and he's like, okay, we got to catch up. We have got to move forward. And he launches something called the Tanzimat Reforms, which is basically, okay, we're going to separate church and state a little bit. We're going to give people equal rights, regardless of what religion they are. We're going to have a non-religious school system. So maybe we can start learning how to do what Europe is doing and start moving in the right direction. Cool. But then a later sultan after that was like, wait, this is giving away a lot of my power and I don't want to do that. So he undid everything. All right. So kind of like Ottoman was in the right position, but then kind of went backwards. Meanwhile, over in India, so over in the Mughal Empire, which remember, yes, I'm talking about India, but at this point, it's controlled by the Mughals, who are Muslim, all right? So it kind of goes in with this, all right? At this particular point, during period 2, the British East India Trading Company had kind of butted into India and started bullying themselves into trade, all right? At this point, they're manipulators, all right? That's what they do. They can manipulate trade. They can say, you can only trade with us, or we can control, rates in this area. And the East India Trading Company, remember, is a private company. It's like Amazon. It's owned by private investors, not by the government of Britain, although they have the British backing because the government's making money off of this. So slowly but surely, the British East India Trading Company had been taking power away from the Mughals. In fact, they actually got tax rights from the Mughals for some of the areas that they controlled. Now, eventually, this is going to really upset some of the sepoys. Okay, the sepoys were Indians who were forced to fight in the British Army by the East India Trading Company. And when the sepoys found out that the gun cartridges they were provided were greased with pig and cow fat, which is cows are sacred to Hindus and Muslims don't eat pork, it caused this sepoy rebellion in 1857. The British put it down, but it made the British government under Queen Victoria go, okay, you guys are done. East India Trading Company, you're not going to be in control here anymore. India is now going to be under the British Raj, which means it's going to be it's going to be ruled by the British instead. And India is going to be de-industrialized. What this means is that prior to this, India was a huge maker of textiles and boats and iron. And Britain's like, listen, we don't need that from you. We can make that ourselves cheaper. We just need your cotton and your ore to make iron. So they basically took India backwards from having all these industries that they had. They just undid all that and basically turned India into an export economy, kind of like they did Egypt. Then we get to period 4, right? Period 4, these old land-based empires are going to collapse. Basically, all of them. Russia will collapse, Qing China will collapse, the Ottomans, the Mughals, all of them are going to collapse. Mainly because of world wars. Okay. So period 4 is the 1900s. Right, and World War I starts in 1914 and runs to 1918. And you can see here, during World War I, the Ottoman Empire made the decision to join up with the Allied powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and at first Italy, but remember, Italy switches sides. They did this mainly because they hate Russia, and they hate Russia because of the Crimean War that they won, but they were mad at Russia for picking that fight. Okay. They're also mad because Serbia used to be part of the Ottoman Empire, and it broke away from the Ottoman Empire, so Russia therefore supported Serbia. Long story short. Now, Obviously, you know, World War I, the Allies win thanks to United States help. The Ottomans actually really put Russia in a position to have to back out of the war because they fought so hard against Britain and France that they couldn't get an IV line in to help Russia, which means Russia had to bail out of the war. Now, after the war is over, the Ottoman Empire is gone. There is no more empire. It's basically down to Turkey. That's it. That's because it's the Turks. That's all that's left. The areas below it, you can see right here, that used to be Ottoman are now going to be under British and French mandate, which means they didn't think these areas were ready for independence yet, which really was because they needed the oil that was there, right? So they controlled these areas, which is when the Jewish people start pushing of the Zionist movement, start pressuring Britain, since they now control this area, to create a state of Israel there for the Jewish people. The British will say, yes, we agree with you. They issue the Balfour Declaration, but they don't do anything because they were just tired from fighting World War I. Now, during this time also, we have to remember that the Ottoman Empire was guilty of one of the worst mass atrocities that took place during World War I, and that is going to be the Armenian Genocide. And the Armenian Genocide is during World War I, this area which was highly Christian. The Ottomans targeted them, saying that they were helping the Russians, and they ended up killing millions of Armenian men, women, and children. And to this day, Turkey, because that's what's left of the Ottoman Empire, refuses to recognize this as a genocide. They recognize it as an act of war, but will not tolerate it being called a genocide. Although a lot of world leaders are starting to say, no, yeah, it was definitely a genocide, and we're going to recognize it as that, whether it makes you mad or not. And down here at the bottom is actually the memorial to the Armenian Genocide. Okay, now, after World War II is over, okay, we start to see decolonization and we see the end of imperialism. And these areas of the world are starting to get their independence. However, we're going to see European countries who lost their colonies, they still want to maintain control of their assets in these areas. In particular, one of those is going to be the Suez Canal, which belonged to Britain. Now, after World War II is over, the new elected president of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, wants to nationalize the Suez Canal, which means it needs to be Egyptian. We should be the ones controlling it, not British troops sitting in it, okay? That causes a huge problem because the British and the French both have a lot of interest in that canal. It is everything to them. So what happens is Israel, a newly created state, Britain and France launch an attack to get the Suez Canal. Gamal Abdel Nasser reaches out to the Soviet Union, who is going to support that. He's going to take advantage of that because that would get other Arabic countries on his side because all the Arabic countries hate Israel. So now we have the Cold War involved in this. Eventually, the United States jumps in and goes, okay, everybody stop, all right? Britain, France, Israel, if you guys don't quit, we are going to put sanctions on you and we're not going to buy your stuff and we're going to put tariffs on your goods. That's it. Done. All right. So eventually the British, the French, and Israel back off and the Suez crisis ends and Egypt does get control of the Suez Canal, but it really does show the world who's really in charge during the Cold War. Then, of course, in this area, we also have in what used to be the Ottoman Empire, which was taken over by the British, we have the creation of the State of Israel, which the United Nations created by putting basically a state. If you look here in 1947, they basically shoved an Israeli state, the state for Jewish people, into what used to be Palestine. This is going to cause some serious problems. And what is going to happen is that the day after this state was created, other states around Palestine who are taking on the refugees that are leaving out of Palestine and have nowhere to go, these Arabic states, which is Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, and Egypt, they all jump in and attack Israel. Israel wins, All right. By the way, I should mention the Soviet Union, because the United States was backing Israel. The Soviet Union during the Cold War is going to back a lot of these Arabic states. Okay. Because they figured if they can get one on their side, they can get all of them, which is not the case because communism doesn't like religion and these countries are all about their religion. Eventually, Israel is not only going to win that war, they're going to win multiple other conflicts to the point of where now, if you look on the far right, the green is all that is left of Palestine, and it's still one of the most highly contested areas in the world. All right. So to wrap this up, this part of the world today, there's still a lot of issues there. Israel and Palestine still fighting. These parts of the world are highly, highly afraid of imperialism and their culture being influenced and taken over. So you get like groups like Al-Qaeda, which is a terrorist group which works to basically scare people out of imperializing their area so that nobody comes into that area. They attack as a way to send a message that we don't want you here, we don't like your culture, we don't want you here. One really good reason for that is they saw what happened in the Iranian Revolution, because after World War II was over, we, the United States, knew there was a ton of oil in Iran. And they had elected a guy in Iran that they wanted in charge. We put a Shah, which is their king, back in power because he agreed to give us access to their oil. Like basically we were just taking their oil out. They weren't making any money off of it. And we were giving him a big cut. So while their Shah is living in royalty, their people are starving to death, and they get leaders who want to nationalize Iran's oil, but we kept putting this guy in power who was very, very hard on his people. He would, any resentment or opposition against him, he would kill and he would put that down. So as a result of that, they eventually overthrew the Shah. He ran away to the United States, and in their revolution, they put in power a religious leader called an Ayatollah. Now, to this day, Iran is a republic. They do elect a president, but he doesn't make a move without the Ayatollah's approval. The Ayatollah is their supreme leader. He has his own military. And one of the things that they did is the Shah that we put in power was very pro-Western. He set up like liquor stores, and he allowed like women to dress in bathing suits, and he had beauty contests because he's very pro-Western. And they didn't like that. It was everything against their culture and everything it stood for. So when the Ayatollah came into power, they reversed everything and basically went back to very super conservative, and have issues today with, you know, Western countries because they basically view any economic activity as imperialism that will also change their culture. So a lot of still issues that are in the Middle Eastern area and in the Islamic world today that result from things that happened even all the way back to period 1.